Hello everyone, welcome back to Unraveling Politics, a weekly political analysis show. Today we have a special episode. We're going to be talking about political bias in the media. So we're going to be talking about bias in the media, of course, where it's a good thing, where it might not be. We're going to talk about what news networks and papers lean politically, and some ways to spot bias if you're unsure. So let's talk about bias in the media. We'll be cliche and we'll start with Webster's Dictionary. Based on a Webster's Dictionary, bias is an inclination or a temperament or outlook. So one of the synonyms is prejudice. In Oxford Languages says bias is prejudice in favor or against one thing, person, group compared with another, usually in a way considered to be unfair. So I'll put a disclaimer here and say that bias is not necessarily a bad thing in general. For example, when I make these episodes, I am biased toward U.S. political news because that is my target audience. And I have bias in what I cover because that's what I've decided is what's best for me in this show. Where bias is bad is where you're generally uninformed about something and you go to a source that's biased without realizing it. For example, say somebody knows nothing about the Russia-Ukraine war and has been living under a rock for the last 4 years, and they go to the news network RT, known as Russia Today. So that is Russian state media. For example, I was staying in Germany a few years ago, and the only channels that were in English, because I only speak English, were Russian television or CNN. And because Russia has state-controlled media, I went with CNN, although I'm not a huge fan of CNN. This was in 2021, so it was before Russia invaded Ukraine, but I was very wary of Russian television. I'm very wary of television from foreign countries, especially that aren't democracies. And looking back, we can see why. So if you know nothing about it and you tuned into Russian television and you heard what they said about the Russia-Ukraine war, they might convince you that Ukraine and NATO started the war and it's a war of self-defense or whatever else that they say. And obviously that's wrong. And we know that. But because we have other news sources and we live in a free country, at least we do here, and we have the full picture. So with that being said, we're going to be talking about some common news sources, where you can get your news, and how I would rate them politically. Before we continue, there is a difference between opinion pieces written under a news network's banner and news from the report. Commentary is not news. For example, I provide commentary. This is not a news show, this is a commentary/analysis show. And that's why I call this a political analysis show and not a news show. I don't provide the news. I provide my analysis on the news. With that being said, let's move forward. So here's the classic left-right spectrum. We have the center in the middle and left and right on each side, and then we have the far left and far right on each end. For the first thing I'm going to put here is we're going to start on the left, and we're going to move, well, I guess the left will be over here for you guys, the left over here, and we're going to move to the right, so we can start with MS Now, formerly known as MSNBC, and the Huffington Post. These are very left-wing outlets. Now, I wouldn't say it's propaganda left, but it is definitely very left-wing. It was very pro-Biden, and it was very anti-Trump. These were outlets that helped cover up Biden's mental decline, so I guess you could say it was propaganda, along with others, as we will get to later. Then we have, moving a little bit more to the center, we have NPR, The Atlantic, CNN, Washington Post, also known as WAPO, and the New York Times. And I would call these center to center left. CNN has definitely moved to the right over the years. They got rid of some of their worst anchors like Brian Stelter. Jake Tapper is still there. He's basically like the left-wing Tucker Carlson. So he's still there. So CNN is definitely still a left-wing news network, but they are a lot less left-wing than they were, say, 8 or 9 years ago. The Atlantic is a written piece as well as the New York Times. And I think the reporting there in the New York Times and the Atlantic isn't too bad. It's not as obvious as MS Now, for example, but they are definitely to the left. NPR, which is National Public Radio, is center to center left. They might even move more to the left because Trump has been going through the motions of defunding them. And I'm sorry, but we don't need NPR or PBS anymore. We have plenty of media that is free. We don't need public media anymore. This is not the 1970s or the 1980s. So really, they shouldn't exist. But anyway, if you're wondering about myself, I feel fairly centrist. I think in 2024, I leaned a little bit more to the right. And last year and beginning this year, I've been feeling I was a little bit more left-wing. And I have personal beliefs on both sides, and that's why you'll never see me really on either extreme. It really depends on the political climate, exactly where I'm at, and of course individual issues on more left-wing or right-wing. And if you disagree, feel free to let me know in the comment section below. As for the centrist news networks, this is where I get the bulk of my news for this show. So that would be Reuters, the AP, Axios, Politico, and the Wall Street Journal. The news only. The Wall Street Journal is part of the Murdoch empire, which is definitely on the right, and we're going to get to that in a moment. But I use those as most of the sources for my news. The Wall Street Journal is more economic stuff, so that's where I get a lot of my economic news. Politico and The Hill is pretty good, and I don't have those on The Hill on the chart, but as you can get a great political news about what is going on Capitol Hill in The Hill. The AP is good too. I don't use them very much, but they're a good source, although they've been having some disagreements with Trump recently. And Reuters is alright, although I don't know much about them. I feel their reporting is fairly centrist. So moving to the right. So I would have the center-right on there would be the Financial Times, The Economist, and the Wall Street Journal. They definitely have written some negative pieces about economic news under the Biden administration, which, to be fair, there were some good and bad aspects of that. And the papers and the TV news segments on the left didn't really do that. So then we have the right wing. So I will get some of my news from the right wing, as I will on the left. I definitely don't get it a whole lot. I've read some Fox News articles. The New York Post tends to be a little overdramatic. Both of those are part of the Murdoch empire, as is The Sun, which is a British newspaper. They're also part of the empire. I don't really have them on here because they're more of a British newspaper. For example, the British Tories, they're usually endorsed by The Sun. The Washington Examiner, I don't really read them either. Same with the Federalist, they're more on the right. The Daily Wire is pretty good if you're more right-wing. Ben Shapiro is definitely on the right. I feel like he's fairly fair in terms of what he says. Like, what he says is not extreme. It's just typical right-wing stuff. So if you are on the right, it will feel very normal. And then they have their own bias. They don't pretend to be unbiased like MSNBC or MS Now, as they're known now. They have their own bias. They admit it, which I deeply respect. I would rather the news do that. And I listen to Matt Walsh sometimes. We agree on social issues, but not on economic issues. So that's where I get more of my right-wing news from. Then we have the far right or the populist right. So I don't listen to read or listen to any of these. This would be Newsmax or Breitbart. The only reason I would open any of these would be as if I want to know what they are saying, but I wouldn't go there for my news. Newsmax, for example, I think 2 or 3 weeks went by before they called the presidential election for Joe Biden, long after everybody else had. And then we have the crazies. So definitely do not go to these for news. These would be people like Candace Owens and Alex Jones, and then there would be Nick Fuentes. They are they're way over there. These people tend to have strong fan bases, and I will admit I used to listen to Candace Owens, but she is extremely right-wing and conspiratorial. Her latest belief is that Tyler Robinson didn't kill Charlie Kirk, and instead she thinks the government did it, something with Egyptian planes and Jewish people and blah, 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 blah. So, yeah. You don't go to her, just like I wouldn't go to Alex Jones. You would have better luck getting your news from a tree than you would from either of them. And then, as I said, I throw Nick Fuentes in there. He is absolutely vile. Nobody should listen to him. He has said things about anti-Semitic. He has said things that are racist, and he's a misogynist. He is absolutely not at all. It really makes me wonder if he actually believes those things or if he does it for attention. So that's the more U.S.-based news. What about the international news? So more international news and papers, I'll just write them down on the whiteboard. The Guardian tends to be more left-wing, and I know I didn't spell it right. The BBC is in the center. They get complaints from both sides. The Telegraph is definitely on the right wing of British politics. They have never endorsed a left-wing party. And unlike here, British newspapers, they endorse political candidates in each election. The Telegraph, for example, has never endorsed Labour. The Guardian usually endorses Labour. Sometimes they endorse nobody. The Sun usually backs the winner, so I would say they're still right-wing, but they're not quite as right-wing. Le Monde in France is more left-wing, as is Der Spiegel, unless you speak French or German. Good luck reading or listening to those. But I thought I'd throw that out there as well. And Sky News UK, I feel like they are fairly centrist. They are on YouTube, and I listen to their pieces, and I felt they have really barely any bias. However, Sky News Australia is on the far right. They're clearly biased. They do not like left-wing candidates. When the left won in Australia's last elections, they were practically distraught. So that concludes the first part of the show. I hope that was informative. Before we wrap up, I want to talk a little bit more about how you can spot media bias, especially if you're more an untrained eye. So let's focus on 4 articles here. It's all talking about the same thing, the possibility of a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine. As I put this podcast together, it was late December, early January. I'm not recording this until February, and I might not even upload this till March or April, maybe later, and you'll know. So this is definitely going to be out of date, the news, but that doesn't really matter. Let's focus on the reporting as opposed to what the reporting is saying. So I have a couple articles, as I said. This one is from Fox News, and Fox News has the headline that, as I said, they're more on the right, and The Guardian is more on the left. I also have Reuters and the New York Post. We'll start with the Fox News article. The first thing to check is if it says opinion, then it's clearly an opinion piece. The Guardian piece is not an opinion, however, it doesn't need to say opinion to actually be an opinion. Then sometimes the headline is revealing. For the Fox News article, the headline says, Trump, Zelensky say Ukraine peace deal close, but thorny issues remain after Florida talks. So if you read this, I feel like that is fairly fair. They said a deal is close, but there's thorny issues remaining, which is, at the time, that is what we were looking at. And if you read through the article, which I'm not going to do here because we'd be here all day, it's linked below. There is very little criticism to the statement, so the headline is all right, which is very common, where the headline says something very different than what's in the article. So the headline, just the headline is fine, but there is very little criticism to what the president said, and I don't mean criticism like, oh, I disagree with this. That there's no opposition parties, there's no experts in the field that are brought up. You don't see any of that here. And it's just some things that Trump said and Zelensky said, and that's it. There's no analysis, there's no nothing. The only negative part in the article, it says, despite the progress, territory, particularly the status of Donbass, remains one of the most difficult unresolved issues, with Trump and Zelensky acknowledging different positions between Ukraine and Russia. So if you didn't tell me what this news outlet this was from, I would have guessed it was a right-leaning outlet. I would not have guessed Fox. I probably would have said the Wall Street Journal editorial, but maybe I would have said Fox. So let's flip to The Guardian. Now, The Guardian is a more liberal piece. There is not a whole lot of positive coverage here of President Trump. The best part of it is where Trump said he offered to address Ukraine's parliament, and clearly the entire piece is negative, and at the very bottom, where very few people get, they usually read the headline, and then if they read any further, they'll read 1 or 2 paragraphs, and then they'll leave. It's all the way at the bottom of the paper. Nearly the entire piece is negative. It says they have an observer who is a founder of a nonprofit, and he is also against Trump, or she, whoever it is. So clearly biased, I would have guessed CNN or maybe Washington Post. And the headline here says, Trump says tough issues remain for Ukraine, peace deal after meeting Zelensky in Florida. So not a great start. So then we have Reuters. Once again, same topic, not an opinion piece. There is fairly balanced reporting, in my opinion. It starts with a few basic facts about the interaction between Trump and Zelensky. Then they bring in Emmanuel Macron, the president of France. He is a big player in this, and his statement on Twitter. It's not perfect, of course. There's no opposition parties, no Democrats are brought in, but it does include aspects that lean toward against a potential ceasefire as well as toward. And at the time that these were written, and right now, and I'm not sure when you're listening to this, that remained up in the air. And the headline says, U.S. and Ukraine a lot closer on peace deal, Trump says after meeting with Zelensky. And they spelled Zelensky wrong, which is not a good sign, but that is... that I think is a little bit more fair. It's a little bit more biased toward Trump, but if you kind of look into the bottom of the summary, it says Zelensky sees agreement on security guarantees for Ukraine. Future of Donbass and other territories sought by Russia remains unsettled. Trump spoke with Putin ahead of meeting on Sunday. So I think that's fairly fair. I think Reuters is pretty good. So I would say that is, if you had told me, if you had said, who do you think wrote this, then I probably would have said it was a centrist paper. And then lastly, we're going to go to the New York Post. The headline reads, Trump willing to travel to Ukraine, pitched to Parliament on ceding land to Russia in bid to end the war. And for some of you, that might be good enough. For me, that's not. As you go through, you have a few statements. It's almost like Trump himself wrote this, because you see things about how Trump ended 4 wars or 8 wars, and there's no mentions about how difficult it may be to negotiate a peace deal. Definitely no opposition parties are brought in, no experts, no nothing. The article nudges the reader toward thinking that a peace deal is going to happen and that Trump will deliver it, and he's the only one that can deliver it. The only negative part in the article is that Ukrainian leaders have been careful to refrain from doing anything that could set Trump off. At one point, Trump briefly appeared to make a quick reference to the infamous February 28, 2025 Oval Office blow-up with Zelensky that has kept Ukrainian officials on the edge when dealing with the famously mercurial Trump. So that's basically it, and that's not even that negative. Once again, in summary, none of these pieces said opinion, none of them. And to be fair to them, I wouldn't label any of them as opinion. But it goes to show you that just because something isn't labeled as opinion doesn't mean it's non-biased. Opinion is basically just commentary. If you want to take a look into these stories deeper, I recommend you check them out, as well as the authors. That is a good way to see the bias, is to learn about who wrote the piece. And obviously you can't do that with every single article that you read. If there's news media you gravitate towards, then that is something to consider. So I want to leave you with a few questions to think about as you are reading and watching the news. Firstly, is this an opinion piece? Second, is the headline stating what is happening or what somebody else said is happening? Because if there's quotation marks, as there is in the Guardian article, usually it means it's reporting what somebody else said is happening. And the New York Post does it a lot. They didn't do it in this instance, but they do it a lot. So if somebody accuses them of lying, they can say, no, we were just reporting about what somebody else said. And then third, what are the sources? Are they reliable sources? Anonymous sources may be okay some of the time, but for important information, they are not reliable. And then if this story is about a politician in particular, does it include other politicians and what they have to say? And lastly, this is more of a gut feeling, and I usually rely on this more than anything because I've been doing this for so long. Is this article more bullish or skeptical? If you can clearly answer that question, then there's probably a bias. Does it obviously go in one way or another? If you answer these questions more no than yes, it probably means it's a bias source. And before we go on, I'm going to circle all the way back to the beginning. All of these articles are about the same topic. This is about the same thing. It's slightly different angles. Bias is not a bad thing. Bias is all around us. We have our own biases. I have my own. However, knowing about them is important because it allows us to better understand our world. And as I showed you with the exercise with news articles, we got very different senses from the very same story. We got more bullish news from the right, more skeptical news from the left, and a more balanced take in the middle. Instead of reading or watching news and thinking of it as an unbiased information, I recommend you choose to view it through a prism. The news often looks at the same object, but from a different angle. So it's best to get as many different angles of that object as you can. So I hope this episode was helpful. I want to give a shout out to my friend Sophie for giving me this idea. We were talking about media bias, and I wanted to make this into an episode. This was about 2 months ago. We talked about it after our conversation. So that is it for this episode. This is not usually what I talk about. So if you like these episodes, please let me know. And if you're new here, please check out some of the other stuff. We have new videos every single week. So that is it for now. Thank you for listening, and I hope to see you next week. As always, please let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Bye-bye.